Killer conversations, just when you thought it was safe to talk to a stranger. Chapter 1. The old lady walked toward him, her wind-sculpted, rust-colored hair swirling around her head. He muttered under his breath, "Don't talk to me or I'll have to kill you." But she kept coming toward him, and the path between the gorse bushes was so narrow that he had no avenue of escape. The roots of gorse loosely held the soil in place, keeping the hill from tumbling into the crashing waves along the edge of the firth below. Heights terrified him. Even now, his knees wobbled when he looked down over the edge. He was trapped. Her face broke into a radiant smile, and she waved at him. She got so close that the watery blue reflected in her eyes. "Hello," she called cheerily as she drew even with him. "I'm so glad I caught you today. I haven't seen you out walking in a while." That was true. He had changed the timing of his walks, and even the circuit, to avoid her, which is why he was on the narrow path now, a path high above the water that he normally avoided because it made him dizzy if he looked down. Now he stood quietly in front of her, willing his lips to curl into a smile that seemed, from his experience, to hold an irresistible allure for women. He knew what he looked like, tall and ridiculously thin from too much walking, with longish brown blonde hair and deeply brown eyes that never followed the false smile of his lips, because joy had died inside him a long time ago. If anyone could smell his soul, it would stink like the rotten dead thing it was. She studied him so intently that he felt his hands clenching and unclenching nervously. When they met on walks, he was usually on a separate path and waved to her or nodded at her from a distance if she spoke to him loudly enough to get his attention. Usually, he completely ignored other people, including her. Seldom was she close enough to get a good look at him, and never before had she been this close to him. She couldn't help the laughter springing up inside her eyes and the widening smile on her lips as she thought, "Trapped! I've trapped him today. He'll have to talk to me or else be extremely rude." And even though he seemed remote and unfriendly, she rightly judged that he was not rude or without manners. She approved of his aesthetic face, long and narrow, with sunken cheekbones and a square chin. Dimples stole into the space at the corner of his mouth when he smiled. Sunlight from the infrequent Scottish sun played across his hair this morning, glinting goldly amid the brown. He was an extremely attractive young man, but he always walked alone, and this puzzled her. A writer's curiosity, perhaps? She was determined to learn more about him. "I'm Kevin Skylamar," she informed him. Kevyn. My folks wanted a boy. My dad loved Scotland, so I got stuck with Skye in honor of the island. Funny, isn't it? The tricks life plays on one. I'm from the US. I was born in Texas. To this day, I've never been to Skye to visit my namesake. I'm a writer. Mostly children's books. Sadly not famous, but I do okay. She thrust out her hand. "Kev to my friends," she added. He ignored the outstretched hand, and after a few seconds she dropped it. For a long moment she feared he wasn't going to respond to the introduction at all. Slowly the smile that never touched his eyes quirked a bit. "John Vickers." He had been surprised when she asked his name. He wore remoteness, matching the barren rock and heather hillsides between Dingwall and Doulapool so intractably that people seldom asked his name. He always hesitated when someone did ask, because he had to remember to lie. John Vickers wasn't his real name, but it was the name for who he had become now. Her demeanor never changed in spite of his reluctant answer. That meant she didn't suspect. He wouldn't need to kill her. "You walk a lot, John. How many miles a day do you reckon you walk? Do you walk just once a day?" "About 4 miles, he said, preparing to pass her on the narrow path. She surprised him by producing a plastic container and thrusting it at him. "Here, I baked this for you. Cake. I hope you like chocolate. It's a special Texas recipe, so I don't imagine you will have tasted anything quite like it before. Although I must say the bakery here in town is excellent. I've become quite addicted to the toffee-filled donuts." Addicted. For a moment the smile dropped from his face. He could almost smell the stench of dead clawing its way up out of his soul and making a break for his open mouth. He fought it back and rearranged the half-smile on his face. But his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides and his fingernails dug into the palms. Kevin Lamar noted the transformation in the quiet man. It puzzled her. Everything about the Walker puzzled her. She had questions, but no one in town seemed to know him or anything about him. He shopped regularly in the little store and came in every morning for newspapers and a breakfast roll, but he never talked to anyone. He's not from these parts, people she asked had responded, as if that solved any mystery connected to the lanky youth. If you don't like chocolate, she suggested gently, I'll make something else next time I get the urge to bake. The smile was back in place. He reached out and accepted the plastic container with a brief nod. Thank you. I was surprised. No one has ever given me anything before. As he spoke, he realized that was true at all levels of his life. Kev grinned at him. Well, they should. I declare, but you could use some good feeding to put some meat on your bones. You'd have to stand beside yourself to cast a shadow. She laughed at her joke, but he brushed past her and rushed off down the narrow path without another word. Well, she said to herself, after watching the straight, narrow back disappear around a bend. I declare but what it's a start. Reckon what's wrong with that young man? I declare but what he doesn't try to walk away whatever it is that torments him. Sandy, John Alexander Hayton, edged away from the nightmarish scene in front of him as far as possible. The 13-year-old tried to claw his way into the shadow at the far corner of the room, but there was no escape from either the violence or his mother's screams. His bruised face and lips tingled from the beating that had been his reward for attempting to protect his mother. Her screams increased the tempo of his own pain to a fiery pitch as the two men tore into her, one from the front and one from the back. Her feet, suspended in the air from being hooked to her abusers, flailed and kicked discordantly. The man in front smacked her when her screams got too loud, and the one in back bit her neck and back until it bled. He stood watching from the doorway, leering, groping himself, and laughing with the hollow, dead sound of a water-filled drum. Panting, the men finished, peeled Sandy's mother away from them and flung her against the bed. She hit the side and slid down to the floor, moaning and weeping. The men stripped off their condoms and threw them on the floor, pulled up their pants, zipped, stuck wads of money into his hands, and left, laughing and arguing about who got to try which hole next time. Sandy puked. He jerked her up from the floor and ordered her back into her clothes. She cowed as he raised his hands over his head when she moved too slowly. Here. He handed her a small portion of the money. Go get some pizza for the kids. They haven't eaten since yesterday. You have enough for that and our fix. Go, woman. Move. Move or I'll bloody well beat you like I did that worthless boy of yours. He had beat Sandy for trying to stop the men, for attempting to rescue his mother from the alcohol and drug-fueled abuse that was a part of his mother's everyday life because they needed the money for the next fix. Everything else in life, especially kids, shrunk in relation to the size of that need. Sandy hurt all over from having been beaten, stomped, kicked. He rose drunkenly to his feet and stumbled toward the door, but it was too late. He heard the padlock on the opposite side snap into place. He was alone, locked in a putrid, stinking room that was unfit for zoo animals. Sandy wanted to wish himself dead. Death was the end of everything. Sandy had no hope or expectation of life after death. It was his birthday today. Not that anyone had noticed or cared. No cake, no card, no mention. Nor would there be. Having survived 13 years of hell, he didn't want more life. He wanted the empty relief of nothingness. Nothing to hurt. To silence the inward wounds that pounded and shrieked and bled as vehemently as the outward wounds caused by repeated beatings. When the screams and sobs from his sister's room started, he looked around his debris-cluttered room for something sharp or hard that he could use to end his life. The shrieks beat against his eardrums, mixing with the racing pulse of his heart until it felt like his ears would rupture. There was no escape from either the padlocked door or through the metal bars on the window. He had tried hammering his way out the window before, only to be rewarded with cuts that got infected and took a long time to heal, and a constant cold, punishing breeze whipping in through the broken glass, which had never been replaced. Nothing broken, old, or ruined was ever replaced at this house. "No, no, no, stop!" Kate sobbed. "Stop, you're hurting me!" But whoever the monster man was, he didn't stop, and his sister's screams rose to a panic level that made Sandy drop to the floor in a huddle and bury his head against his knees. He pulled his winter coat more tightly around his body, but he couldn't stop shivering. He rocked back and forth, eyes squinted shut, arms hugging his knees, back and forth like a rocking chair. But rocking chairs didn't go anywhere, and he couldn't escape the suffocating hopelessness drawing up around him like a burial shroud. Jean was screaming too, but being older, her cries were mingled with profanity as she fought against the man-monster raping her. Sandy knew what was happening. He had seen it before. He had tried to stop it before. They, the inhuman monster mother who had given them all birth but little else, and the current he of the moment, had beat Sandy so savagely that it had been weeks before he could go back to school. Sandy's left arm had been broken and never healed right. It had a strange crook in it that shouldn't have been there. Perversely, even though Sandy was traumatized and sickened by the sexual abuse of his sisters, he was thankful not to have experienced it himself. They had tried to sell him for drugs too. He had heard the negotiations. But so far, the men had preferred young girls like Kate, who was only 7, and Jean, who was 10. Sandy knew that unless he could get away, his time was coming. The screams gradually stopped, broken down into heart-wrenching sobs. "I hate you, I hate you, I hate you!" Jean screamed. Sandy wondered if his sister was screaming at them or at whatever monster had attacked her, stealing whatever shreds of childhood she had left and dropping them in the putrid, stinking septic tank of his deranged mind. 13 should have been too old to cry, Sandy thought, but he cried anyway. For his sisters and for himself, never for them. He remembered how it had been once, so many terrors ago, when he had a real mom and dad, and their home rocked with love and laughter, instead of cursing, violence, crying and screaming. It was so long ago, and he had been so young, that it was hard to remember exactly what had happened. It was his fault, that he knew. On his 6th birthday, his parents had taken him to the public swimming pool. An older boy had dared Sandy to go off the high dive. Sandy had climbed up, inched out on the board, and frozen. Even jeers and yells from the others waiting in the queue to dive hadn't moved Sandy. His feet were glued to the board. He could not move forward to the end of the board, nor could he back up to go back down the ladder. The older boy climbed up, rushed him, and knocked him off the board into the water. Sandy had hit his chin on the edge of the board on the way down, receiving such a deep gash that it had required stitches, and left him with a slightly uneven smile, when he smiled, which was rare. His mother had ranted at his father for being too drunk to watch his own son and keep him from danger and injury. His father had countered, calling his mother a worthless, lazy pothead who couldn't even watch her own children and keep them from getting hurt. The fighting started. It never quit. His dad came home from the pub later and drunker than before, with no patience in his demeanor and no money in his pockets. Somehow she had kicked their dad out. A string of men followed, and she and whatever he it was at the time slowly became they, as alcohol escalated into drugs, and evil and vile shared the same address with them in their Glasgow flat.